Okay, there we go. So now we're being recorded, and I can deny everything I just said because that wasn't being recorded. I wasn't there. Okay, so let's move on. So the IMRAD structure, feel free to interrupt me with questions, by the way, too. Here's an overview of a scientific paper. So I've tabulated it here, and you can see in the first column on the left there, we have this IMRAD structure. IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. If we think about a paper as an organism, if you like, this IMRAD structure is the anatomy of the paper. And I suppose the physiology is how all that anatomy works together to give the paper life. And so the next column across describes the physiology of the paper, if you like. Of course, each paper has an abstract, and that's like the shop window, the front end of the paper. It answers the question, what's this all about? You know, and as you know, it's a way for busy readers to have a preview of the paper and decide whether or not they want to invest the time and effort into reading the full paper. And a badly done abstract doesn't help anybody, of course. The abstract is usually structured as well. Even if the journal doesn't require a structured abstract, I usually put my abstract together as a structured one and then just delete the headings afterwards. For example, the Journal of Dental Research doesn't want structured abstracts. Gerodontology, by contrast, the journal for which I'm editor-in-chief, we certainly do want structured abstracts. Okay, so the introduction, why was it done? So why, you know, it explains to the reader why this study was done, what you did, and why, why you did it. It summarizes the context of the study and clearly states the aims. So it should be a compelling exposition of the issues and why this study was actually done. The fourth column here, I've got the length in the manuscript. So MS is publisher speak for manuscript rather than Master of Science. So the abstract should all fit on one page of text. The introduction generally is 1 to 2 pages. Then the methods. Having set out your research question or your hypotheses that you're going to test, the aims of your paper in the final paragraph of the introduction, you then go on to the methods and tell the readers what was actually done. What did you do to answer your research question? And a key principle here is to give enough detail so that a reader is able to replicate your study. Almost everybody won't, of course, but you know, they say that you should give enough detail so that the study can be replicated. The other function of that, of course, is to enable the reviewers to look at in detail what you did and to scrutinize those methods to determine whether or not the methods you used were appropriate for the study, for the research question and the study design. The results, this is where you present what was found. You know, what answer did you get? So if you're doing, say it was an epidemiological study of older people, this is where you describe how you obtained your sample, how you determined the appropriate sample size, what measures you used, and what analyses you used. And when you're describing the methods you used, the measures you used, of course, they should all be referenced so that the reader and the reviewer are able to determine whether or not you use the appropriate scales or the appropriate ways of measuring, say, periodontitis or tooth loss or dental caries experience. The discussion is where you put the findings in context and interpret those. So it answers the question, what does it mean? You know, what did you actually, what do your findings mean in the context of the existing knowledge and the existing literature, the existing understanding of the phenomenon that you have explored in your research study. In each of the methods, results, and discussion section is generally 2 to 3 pages in the manuscript. And then we have, following the discussion in the paper, you'll have the tables and the figures. And you'll have 1 table per page and 1 figure per page. And these will be well laid out so that the readers are able to follow what you did. And a well laid out table is a very, very useful thing. I say a good table is a thing of beauty. In your references list, who else has done important work here? And this is where you cite the most recent and relevant literature on the topic. And generally it's between 15 and 30 references. Some papers will take fewer, some papers will take far more. Are there any questions about this IMRAD structure of the paper at this stage? It's something that generally, well, certainly when I was a junior researcher, it wasn't taught. We were expected to pick this stuff up by osmosis, by having read papers, having read hundreds of papers. And we were somehow expected to understand and pick up what, how to structure our papers. But I found that having an overview like this is a very useful way to get a feel for how a scientific paper should be structured. So I've got, these are just some things some principles that I've found are important when writing a paper. So I've got some do's and don'ts here, and I've got a do and a don't for each section of the paper. And so in the abstract, do summarize your study. It seems sort of weird to state the obvious, but the abstract is a summary of the study. What you set out to do, how you did it, what you found and what it means, and about 4 paragraphs. And a key principle is to include some actual study data. I see papers come in all the time with abstracts where the only thing you see in the results paragraph is p-values. Now, two points here. One is we're moving away from p-values. The other is that I'm not interested in the p-values per se. I want to see the data. I want to see the most important data from your study actually presented in the results paragraph of your abstract. The introduction, it should make a compelling case for conducting your study. And it's a good idea to use a template for that, and I'll come to that soon. What we don't want is a comprehensive literature review, and we don't want you to omit important work by others. So there's this tension. On the one hand, we don't want to have an 80-page review of all of the literature on your topic, but we do want you to include the most important work and how it has shaped your research question for your study. The methods, tell them what you did, justify the numbers, describe the sampling, and use a template for this too. Now, it's important to describe the sample and the sampling because that is the key issue on which the generalizability of the findings rests. So if you have a clinical convenience sample, you say you've done a study in a couple of nursing homes and you are describing the oral health of the residents of those nursing homes with a particular focus, say, on dry mouth and medications or whatever, it's important to realize that that is a convenience sample. So the findings are not generalizable beyond that particular setting. On the other hand, by contrast, if you are using epidemiological data and there was a proper, if you like, sampling strategy, and you have a sample which is representative of the source population, then you can generalize those findings. And so in your discussion, you can be more inclusive in how you talk about the meaning of your findings, because they represent the source population. In the methods, don't give any results. If you're talking about the participation rate for your study, etc., that wait until you get to the results section for that. If you're referring to a particular scale that you have used or a particular method, don't refer the readers to other papers for details that should be in your paper. If you say, oh, we measured salivary flow after Fox et al. 1987, actually describe how you measured that salivary flow. If salivary flow rates are a key part of your paper, you shouldn't expect the reader to have to go charging off and find the paper somewhere else. In the results, present and briefly describe your data and use tables as much as possible. Another key principle here is not to repeat the table data in the results text. So what you're doing is you're drawing the reader's attention to the important parts of the tables. They can see the data in your table because it's going to be right beside your results paragraphs in the final published paper. So they don't need to have you repeat the table data in the text, because that just gets boring. Don't cite anyone in a results section, and don't comment on your results. Don't say, wow, this is amazing. What we've seen here is actually a far stronger effect than was observed by Brown et al. 2017. That bit, those sorts of gee whiz comments belong in the discussion. The results section is just purely your findings, your results. For the discussion, as an editor, one of the things I've noted over the years is that very few discussion sections for papers are at the appropriate length. Most people get far too discursive and have a far longer discussion than they actually need to have. So it's important to use a template for your discussion and not to write it without a plan, because you'll just end up with something which is overly rambling and discussing every little finding, which you don't actually have to do. For the references, be consistent and follow the journal's instructions. Each journal does its references in its own way, and it likes to have the referencing, references formatted, the citations with the within text citations done in its particular format. If you use EndNote, and a lot of people do, check it very carefully. And once you generate your references list, EndNote can go rogue on you, and you need to very carefully check the output and format it, get in and edit it, and make sure that it's not including unnecessary information or it sometimes has problems with authors' names. So you've got to be check very carefully that your references list is okay. And there's no better way to do that than to print it out. Look at it in hard copy. Are there any questions about the anatomy and structure of a paper at this stage? No? Cool, we'll move on. Proofing your work. I've just mentioned printing out your references section and going through it carefully. Nothing beats printing your work out and looking at it in hard copy. Because we spend most of our research lives, it seems, staring at computer screens, and they're great, and they really have made a difference. I'm old enough to remember when we used to mail off 3 copies of our paper with a covering letter to a journal and wait 3 or 4 months for the reviews and the decision to come back. And then if we had to revise and resubmit, wait another 3 or 4 months. Things are a lot quicker these days. The problem with that speed is that we tend to, it's very easy just to throw something together and send it off, to submit it without actually having read it properly. So I always print my work out and I come back to it either later the same day, at least 2 hours later, or the next day. And I have a pencil in my hand and I go through it very carefully to check it for the flow of the writing, the readability, the flow of ideas, and to see that, to check that the paper hangs together. And you're looking for mistakes. You're also looking for typos where your fingers I have fat fingers and these small keyboards, it's inevitable that I will have typos. Also, you're looking for poor sentence structure, making sure that your nouns and your verbs agree, that you've got, that your subjects agree with your objects, etc. Don't just submit it without having done this first, because the last thing you want is the reviewers pointing out your errors in this respect, or even worse, the editor having to do it before it even goes out to reviewers. So what does the editor do? As editor of Gerodontology, I have the privilege of reading every paper carefully as it comes in. And I then make a decision over whether the paper is at a level of technical writing and science and interest, potential interest to the readership, to be sent out to review to at least 2 reviewers. And I have a team of associate editors who are marvelous people, who are fellow academics. And if you like, they are almost like editors in training, if you like, because most of us who are editors-in-chief have done some service for at least one journal as an associate editor. In fact, I have acted as an associate editor for the European Journal of Oral Sciences for over 10 years now. And it's a very interesting gig, and I enjoy doing that for that particular journal, because it's a totally different set of papers in science from something like gerodontology. So anyway, I have my 7 associate editors, and I will assign a paper to the associate editor if it makes the grade. If it doesn't make the grade, I do what's called a desk reject, where I will write to the authors turning down the paper, but with a brief couple of comments on the reason for that immediate rejection. It's called a desk rejection, and it happens to us all. So the associate editor's job is to choose at least 2 reviewers and then to manage the paper through the review process. And this can take some time because we don't pay reviewers, and reviewers are people like us. They're busy academics, and they have a lot of, the academic job, the academic life is a very complex one, and the work comes in waves and can be overwhelming at times. And so there are times when I'm unable to take on a paper to review for another journal, and other times when I'm able to do a couple. Once the reviewer does agree to do the review, they then get 4 to 6 weeks to do that. And if they're really busy, but they really want to review the paper, and this happens, we can give them more time to undertake the review. Once the reviews come in, the associate editor gets a message from the ScholarOne system that Wiley uses for gerodontology and all of its journals, and is alerted to the fact that the reviews have come in. And so he or she logs into the site and looks at the reviews and then makes a recommendation to me, the editor-in-chief, on what they think should happen with the paper. And I take those recommendations by the associate editors very seriously, of course, because they have done all that hard work and done that hard work for me, and I value their opinions very much because they are very sound scientists. But ultimately, the editor-in-chief makes the final decision. So it's not unheard of for, say, a reviewer to recommend minor revisions, but for me, I then read the paper again in the light of the reviews, and I may feel that the paper needs major revisions, which means that when it comes back in after being revised, it will go back out to reviewers. Or it might be that the paper will get a reject and resubmit decision. So that means that the science is good, the data are good, the research question is good, but the way the study has been executed and written up, there needs to be some more, quite a lot more work done. So we give the authors the opportunity to take the paper away, start again, and submit it as a completely new submission. The decision you don't want is a reject decision. Everybody gets them. I got one just 2 days ago, so it happens. So the reviewers are out there to make sure that only the best work makes it into print. I have a picture here of a big cat on the savannah in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, here on the periphery of a herd of whatever those things are, wildebeest maybe, I'm not quite sure. And what that big cat is doing is working out who's the weakest in that particular herd, and it's going to go for it. And through that process, maybe it's an old failing wildebeest, it's going to strengthen the herd by doing that. So the reviewer's part of their job is to cull the weakest papers, the poor work from the herd of the scientific literature. They usually stay anonymous, and they certainly do for gerodontology. We have an anonymous review system, whereas some of the other journals, such as BMC Oral Health, BMC Public Health, they run a system where not only are the reviewers known to the authors, but when the paper is published, the reviewers and their reviews are actually published along with the paper. Nothing concentrates your mind and makes you a better person as a reviewer than the prospect of that. So it's actually quite a constructive system. But for gerodontology, of course, we have an anonymous review system. So reviewers are usually experienced researchers, and they do give very useful advice, and they are usually right. Sometimes I might, as an editor, override what a particular reviewer or even the associate editor has said, but I will do it on the grounds of science or sound scientific writing rather than, well, there's no other reason to do that. So the reviewers, if we look at what they're scrutinizing, they're looking at the scientific rigor. They're looking at the study design, whether it was appropriate for the research question. And that's a very important point. You have to have the appropriate design for the research question you're asking. So if you've got a cross-sectional study, you cannot answer questions about the natural history of a condition. You need a prospective cohort study for that, for example. The adequacy of the data, the measures and the analyses, and the importance and the originality of the findings. Now, not all papers need to report original findings. You know, replication is a key principle in science, but it certainly helps. You know, it makes your study more tempting for journals if you can add value to the findings that are out there already. They look at the validity of your conclusions. You know, are the conclusions that you've made in your paper actually based on the findings? And the completeness of the literature cited. Have you missed out important previous studies that have added, you know, essential knowledge to our knowledge of this particular area, yet you've failed to cite them in your paper? The adequacy and clarity of the writing. You know, if you're not able to get the message across because the technical writing is deficient, then that's a serious issue. And also, finally, and probably most importantly, the interest to the journal readership. And that's an area of judgment. It's a value judgment that the reviewers make. It's also a value judgment that is made by the associate editors and the editor-in-chief. And as editor-in-chief, I have final say on that. So if I think, oh, this is not going to fly with the journal readership, it should go to another journal, I will tell the authors that. So what stops papers getting past the first stage, perhaps most importantly, is that they're out of the journal's scope. You know, gerodontology is a journal where we're publishing work on the oral health of older people. It's a very wide brief, but we still get papers submitted that are do not even mention older people. You know, and they're clearly out of the scope of our particular journal. If a paper is very poorly written and we can't work out what the authors are saying, then clearly it goes no further. And so it's going to be desk rejected. So as editor-in-chief, I'm going to reject that paper straight up. If the topic is not of interest to the readership, just been talking about that, or the paper adds nothing new, it's what we call a Me Too paper, or it's not innovative or relevant. This is one that bugs the editor in particular. The authors completely ignore the instructions to authors. And when you're thinking about, if you're thinking about submitting a paper to gerodontology, get onto our website. There is a very big section, detailed section there of instructions to authors, and read through that very carefully. In fact, print it out and highlight the very important parts so that you don't forget to do those, to follow those instructions. Now we're going for time. We've got 20 minutes left. Are there any questions at this stage? As I said, feel free to butt in and ask questions. this is being recorded as well, so you and others will be able to watch it later on if I've gone through anything too quickly. Robert.
I have a quick question just on kind of going between this is a replication study versus a Me Too paper.
Yeah.
Just tips on finding that line of here's something that is known, but we have a good way of confirming it versus this is a, as you call it, a Me Too paper.
Yeah, yeah, that's where you have the challenge of, in your introduction, setting it up so that, you know, I always say when you're writing an introduction section, use 3 paragraphs: what we know, what we don't know, and why this study was done. So those 3 paragraphs, just to structure it, to come up with a compelling introduction. In that what we don't know section, that's where you can set your study up, where you can say, you know, while we do know this, what we don't know is whether it holds in other populations or other settings, and why that is an important research question to answer. And then in the discussion, that's where you revisit that issue, and then you tell the reader why this is an important paper and why it was important to replicate this approach in order to see whether, whatever those earlier findings were, see whether they hold in this population or this sample, this setting. Make sense? It's about how you spin it, in other words.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Bad signs in the editor's eyes. Over the years, I think I've handled more than 5,000 papers in my editorial roles for various journals. And it's almost a truism that if a paper comes in and the paper title is all in capitals, it's generally not very good science. For some reason, it's just one of these flags that says to me, this paper is probably not going to fly. If the authors have misspelt their own names or their co-authors' names, that's also a bad sign, because, you know, we're into dental research, you know, oral health research, you know, we're dental people, we're meant to be detailed people, you know, and if we haven't got the attention to detail where we can spell our co-authors' names properly, or even our own names, then there might be a problem. Failure to follow journal instructions in terms of how the paper is structured or the referencing, and also poor table layout. You know, on our website, we have a PDF on how to lay out a table, and it has some excellent instructions there and advice on formatting a table and what to do and what not to do. Also, we don't want the paper itself to be single-spaced. It's too hard to read, and it's too hard to write annotations on it when we're going through it as reviewers and editors. You'll see that most journals will ask you for double spacing. And in fact, double spacing is too hard to read as well, because there's too much space between the lines. The sweet spot is 1.5 spacing. So I always advise people to format the body text of their paper in as 1.5 spacing. Your tables should be single spaced, but the body text of the paper used 1.5 spacing. Responding to reviewers. You'll get the reviews back and you'll think, oh my God, you know, these are just, there's too much work to do here. Where the heck do I start? You've just got to be systematic about it. And the first thing I do is that because the reviews always come by email, I copy and paste those reviews, the reviewer points into a Word document. And then that becomes the basis, well, that becomes my response to reviewers' document. Because under each reviewer point, I will have an author response in which I respond to those points. And there should be a valid response to every point made by the reviewer. You might think the reviewer is an idiot and that they've missed the point completely, but you've got to respond to those points and push back where appropriate. Make the amendments to the paper in a different colored text so that when the paper comes in to me as editor and I send it out to the reviewers again, everybody can see exactly what's changed in the paper from the previous version. And don't use track changes. Track changes is good for when we're collaborating on a paper among authors, but it very quickly gets messy and it's not reviewer friendly. So try to avoid that. This is how I do it. This is a photo of my desk from last week. I'm revising a paper. You'll see that I like to work with a couple of screens. And so if you're able to do that, it's great. So I have the paper being revised on the right there. And you can see that there's some, a few lines down, I've got some red text there. So this is text that I have added to the paper in response to a review comment. On the left, I have my response document. And as I revise the paper, I'm going down through the review comments. And as I change something to the paper, I'm putting in the response document, I'm writing something about how I've amended the paper. And so when I'm revising paper, that's what I do. I always have both documents open. And that also, it makes it easier, much easier for me. And it also ensures that I don't miss anything. Principles: respond politely, respond completely. So never ignore a point made by a reviewer, because they've made that point because they think it's important. So you can't sort of just dismiss it and say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not even going to look at that comment because I don't like the point that they made. You actually have to respond to that point. If you disagree with the reviewer, then push back. But you actually have to do it with science. You can't do it emotively. You can't say, oh, I was offended by that comment. That who cares? What you have to do is respond with science and preferably citing other published work that supports your point. There's a very good article on the Wiley blog here that I put the URL at the bottom there, how to deal with reviewer comments. Take a look through that. It's very useful. So rejection reasons. So if a paper comes back to me as editor and the reviewer recommends that the paper be rejected and not given another chance, what I've done here is I've just pasted in some typical comments from reviewers from papers where we have rejected them outright. So awful mess, would need a lot of work to get into shape. That sort of goes without saying, doesn't it? Poorly organized. So again, this is why I say write to a template. Use a template for your introduction in particular, and a template for your discussion in particular. Those are the two crucial parts of the paper where you should really plan them very carefully. Misciting the literature. I've published a few papers over the years, and it's nice to be cited by people, but it's not nice to be cited where they have actually missed the point of what I was writing in that paper. Not being responsive to earlier reviews, struggles to get its message across, not an orderly flow. No clear research question or study aims. You can see how that would be a fatal flaw. The analyses unrelated to the study aims or research question. That's another doozy. Unconvincing, too many fatal flaws, or inappropriate generalizing. All of these really are, they're game breakers, Major revision, imprecise writing. We can fix the writing. But technical writing is a very precise way of writing it. You have to be very efficient, and you can't be flowery. You know, you can't use things like is related to or is linked to or whatever. You've got to talk about things being associated or something causing something else. Having an uninformative abstract or the introduction doesn't make a compelling case for the study. The discussion is just too long and meandering all over the place. Interesting data, but the paper is poorly written and boring. That's a bad one too. If the paper is just dull, you know, you can ginger it up a bit, but you know, we have our hands tied in this technical writing. We can't be too flowery, but we can make our papers interesting. Minor revision, good science, but the writing needs attention, or some minor points need clarification. Outright rejection, you're not going to get another chance. Major revision, you've got another chance, but boy, you better come back with a great paper. Minor revision, this is great. You know, you just need to tweak to adjust a few things, and we're not going to send it out to reviewers again. This comes from an editorial, the Australian New Zealand Journal of Public Health, the 7 deadly sins of rejected papers. And it's well worth looking this paper up. The topic not relevant, an overall lack of focus, an inappropriate or weak method section, a poorly structured results section, inappropriate or insufficient interpretation. So that's a discussion section sin. Inadequate attention to the study implications. And again, that's the discussion. We are tying it together in the final section of the paper, or a weak scientific writing or presentation style. So we come to the end, really. I've just put this up again because I think it's worth revisiting, you know, the do's and don'ts of writing a paper. I just put this up for you to look at, and you know, I wish you luck with your scientific writing and you know, with submitting papers, and I look forward to getting your work submitted to gerodontology. And you know how I think now, so good luck. Salma.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. And I do have a question. So if we are collecting data that are extensive, and we are thinking to publish it in different like articles, more than one article, but we'd like to make it building on each other. So how we are referring to the previous one and the previous one without making it not concise or like getting out of the scope, or so how can we do that?
Yeah, it's a bit of an art, really. It's like walking across a tightrope, really, because what you also, you know, if you're publishing multiple papers from a particular big data collection, say you've done a big survey and you've got lots of data, you know, and you want, you can see that there are a number of very good, discrete, standalone papers from that work. You don't want to be accused of the dreaded salami publication, you know, where you're slicing off the salami as thinly as possible to get as many slices as possible. So part of your introduction section is where you walk that tightrope. You know, you make the point that, you know, or maybe in the discussion, it might be appropriate where you could refer to that earlier work from the study, say your big survey or whatever, but you know, you put it into context and you make the case for writing and you know, submitting that particular paper, that you're building on those earlier findings and that this is a natural extension of that earlier work, yada, yada, yada. You know, I've done a lot of work in prospective cohort studies over the years, and clearly, you know, you don't just do a big prospective cohort study and just publish one paper. You're continually publishing work from those studies, and it's, I've had the occasional accusation of, oh, these guys are slicing the salami a bit thinly here. So it's about how you frame and set up your paper so that you anticipate those criticisms. So if you think about what the reviewers might say in respect of your paper about that issue, then you can anticipate it and deal with it in the paper. So you're always thinking ahead to what potential reviewers might say about your paper, and then you try to anticipate that and try to get your paper to the point where it won't attract that criticism. It's easier said than done, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. I see we're almost at the end. So are there any final questions, Robert?
Thanks again for the presentation, but a lot of times you mentioned using a template. Are there any good online templates or things that you would recommend to base our future templates off of?
Yes, actually, that's a very good point. Let me just find, I'm just going to very quickly find a presentation. I will put that on there. Just bear with me for a second or two. Okay, now let me just find it here. So template, I'm going to share my screen here again. Okay, so the introduction section of the paper. This is not, never should be, a literature review. Let me just. It's the section that makes a compelling case for conducting the study. And as I say here, it can be the hardest part to write, because you've got to synthesize a great deal of literature down to 3 paragraphs, basically. What we know, so current knowledge, what we don't know, and then why this study was done. So apologies for the recording and the pre-recording there. That's from a so I won't use the slideshow view there because we'll get this text. This is the discussion template. This is a useful way to structure your discussion. And in fact, if you've got a pen in your hand, there's a very interesting and useful editorial in the British Medical Journal from 1999, and it's by Doherty and Smith. So it's 1999, volume 318, pages 1224 to 1225. And that sets out and describes this discussion structure. And it's a really good one to use. And I always use this for my discussion sections because it keeps me on the straight and narrow. And it's a brilliant template. So take a screenshot of this and look up that BMJ paper, and you'll find it very, very useful. Does that answer your question, Robert?
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. Let me just screenshot it.
Yeah. So I won't stop
Okay.
sharing it. Let me
There you
know
go.
when you've. Okay.
I got it.
Cool.
Thank you.
So there. I hope this has been useful. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I've got a full day ahead of me, but yeah, I'm up now, so things are going to happen. So lovely to
Thank you
meet
very
you,
much.
and I wish you luck with your scientific writing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. See you all.